What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Today we're going to be talking about the longest murder trial in West Virginia state history, that being the trial of Sid Hatfield and the other individuals involved in the Battle of Matewan. And this trial really had everything. It had love triangles, it had spies, it had blatant witness intimidation, and it all happened because of the fallout from the Battle of Matewan, which I recently did a video on. If you haven't watched that one yet, definitely go check it out. I'll put a little tag to it up here right now. But long story short, what ended up happening was private detectives were called into the town of Matewan to evict people from company housing. The lawman and mayor of Matewan had made several attempts to prevent this from happening, or at least buy more time for people to make arrangements before they were evicted out of company housing. Now, because company housing was on mine property, there was very little that they could do, but what they could do was that they could charge these private detectives with actions they did within Matewan city limits, and what they attempted to do was charge these private detectives with carrying weapons through Matewan city limits. When they approached the detectives with warrants in order to try and arrest them, a gunfight broke out. 7 Baldwin Felts detectives and 3 citizens of Matewan were killed in the shootout. And 2 of the detectives killed in the shootout were brothers of one of the founders of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, and he swore revenge against Sid Hatfield and the others involved in the Battle of Matewan. In the days and weeks after the Battle of Matewan, both sides buried their dead. And this was seen as a major victory for miners in the area, causing non-union miners to unionize in droves, and there was a mass exodus from company housing to the point where the United Mine Workers of America actually had to establish a tent colony, kind of a collection of shanty towns for all these union miners who were finding themselves being kicked out of company housing. And with the rise of these tent colonies, violence between the miners and the mine guards and private detectives just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Things got so out of hand that the government of Kentucky actually contacted the government of West Virginia to ask them what was going on in southern West Virginia, to which West Virginia Gov said there's absolutely nothing going on here, and Kentucky sent their National Guard to the border with Mingo County in order to try and keep the peace, which did very little besides make things easier for the Union coal miners who were having trouble differentiating targets across the Tug River in Kentucky. But now that the National Guard was there and they were all dressed alike, it made things much, much easier. And really, once the violence kind of reached a height, there was a grand jury indictment for Sid Hatfield and 22 other individuals for their role in the Battle of Matewan. Thomas Felts had personally pushed for charges to be brought up against these individuals for the death of his brothers and was willing to go to any length to see Hatfield and what he saw as Hatfield's co-conspirators put into the penitentiary. And you might think with charges being brought up against these individuals, the community would kind of settle down a little bit, let the courts take care of it, let things be handled by the law. Nope, within a matter of days, one of the individuals that took part in the grand jury was shot and killed in broad daylight. One of the first major hurdles that was ran into trying to bring this case to trial was finding an unbiased jury in Mingo County in the 1920s. The vast majority of people living in the area either worked for the mines or had relatives, friends, family that did work in the mines. And considering how long the government and the coal companies had been oppressing these workers, finding an unbiased jury was extremely difficult. And while the selection process was going on, the West Virginia state capitol burned down. Yes, at the height of civil unrest and violence, the state capitol burned down. It didn't actually burn down, it caught fire, and the state government had been hoarding massive amounts of machine guns and ammunition that were left over at the end of World War I for reasons. They fully intended on using them against miners if violence ever got out of hand. They knew that the miners probably had something to do with it, but the miners knew that the state government shouldn't have been hoarding that many guns and ammo, so penalties offset, and eventually, after a pretty good chunk of time, they did find enough jurors that they could hold the trial. And on the first day of the trial, the Baldwin-Felts actually provided extra security. Yes, witnesses, jurors, and defendants were actually forced to walk past about 40 heavily armed private detectives who were there to try and remind these people who they thought were in charge, and just to try and intimidate everyone just a little bit more, just one last time before the trial began. And the very first day, there was a little bit of excitement when, remember in my last video when I said that Sid Hatfield had 2 revolvers that he brought absolutely everywhere with him? Yeah, no, he brought those to trial with him too, because why not? And by the end of the first day, the judge in the trial kind of took an unprecedented step and revoked the bond of all of the defendants, requiring them to spend the rest of the trial in a nearby jail. Now, luckily for them, the jailer was super sympathetic to their cause. He actually allowed them to kind of had free reign of the prison, allowing them to visit each other, play games together, socialize, and on Sundays, their wives and girlfriends and mothers were allowed to bring them meals, and partying was kind of so common that afterwards, Sid Hatfield described the place as the Matewan Hotel. Now, super early on in the trial, there was a little bit of excitement when they found out that the charges had been dropped against one of the miners. And then, to their dismay, they took the witness stand against them. Yes, they managed to flip one of the miners, and his testimony was actually pretty damning against Sid Hatfield. He accused Sid Hatfield of murdering Mayor Testerman so that he could marry his wife. Now, why would he say something that insane? Because between the shootout and the trial, Sid Hatfield married Mayor Testerman's widow. And just full stop for a minute, okay? I've done some really stupid things when it comes to women, but not even I would do something as dumb as marrying someone's widow in a case that I was probably going to be going to court for. Like, I would absolutely never do that. Unless she was like under 5'5" with freckles and glasses, in which case it would be like toss up 50-50 at best. I don't have a type. You have a type. As the trial drug on, there was another surprising witness, an individual named C.E. Lively. And Lively had been a member of the United Mine Workers of America for a very long time. He knew the inner workings of the union and had been friends with many of the defendants for the trial of Matewan. But he had also been a spy for the Baldwin-Felts for nearly a decade. Remember the strikes out in Colorado that the Baldwin-Felts were infamous for firing machine guns into tent colonies? Yeah, C.E. Lively had been a spy for them all the way back then and had given the Baldwin-Felts information the entire time. Like, I don't think you understand how big of a deal this is. They had a man on the inside that knew everything about the Union, and the Union had no idea about it, but they were willing to compromise that to try and get a conviction against Sid Hatfield. And Lively agreed that he had been told by Sid Hatfield that Sid Hatfield wanted to murder Mayor Testerman so that he could marry his wife. And he chatted in super deep detail about how he saw nothing wrong with playing both sides of the fence, being part of the Union, and being a spy for the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. He absolutely loved bragging about his accomplishments within the detective agency. And he might have talked a little bit too much, because when he was cross-examined, his story really started falling apart. When asked if he saw anything wrong with being a spy in the Union, he said absolutely not. And he said he was making good money doing it. When asked if the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency had tried hiring Sid Hatfield, he said, yeah, multiple times. When asked if the detective agency had tried bribing Hatfield and Testerman, especially there was an instance where they were trying to get machine guns up on the rooftops of some of the buildings in Matewan, just in case there was ever an attempted shootout. And both men said no. They tried multiple times with varying amounts of money, and Testerman and Sid Hatfield always said, absolutely not. We will not let you do that. Which paints a contrasting image of Sid Hatfield. If he was really the kind of scoundrel that would murder a man just to steal his wife, why wouldn't he take money from a detective agency to put machine guns up on some of the buildings, or take a very lucrative job from the company? Again, if he was just some type of scoundrel. And the defense really became entrenched. This was a great victory. Getting Lively to admit this stuff and say these good things about Hatfield was a huge win. The defense went fully entrenched and said, you see that? This is all a fraud. This is all a fake. They're making up stuff about Sid Hatfield and the rest of these men. This is just outside influence and the coal companies trying to oppress these individuals, trying to intimidate these people, and you and the entire community of Matewan. On March 8th, the closing arguments of the trial began, and both sides made their final cases. The prosecution claimed that all the remaining defendants and Sid Hatfield were cold-blooded, premeditated murderers. And the defense said that this was just another case of corporate meddling and political corruption that should never have gone to trial in the first place. Which, yeah. The jury would deliberate for 2 days before coming to a final verdict. I think one of the jurors basically summed up the opinion of everyone in the room by saying, when the trial started, there was snow on the ground and the trees were barren. Now the hills are green and the dogwoods and laurels are in bloom. But I'll sit here until the trees are barren again before I'll find a single one of those boys guilty. And I'd like to think that this guy went full 12 Angry Men on the rest of the jurors. If you don't know that movie, if you don't get that reference, watch a black and white movie every now and then. It's a classic. But to be honest, this was Southern West Virginia in the 1920s. Again, everyone involved in that area was either a miner themselves or knew someone who was, and knew that the coal companies and West Virginia Gov were highly corrupt, and I wouldn't say a whole lot has changed. When the verdict finally came down, it was not guilty, and charges were dropped against all the individuals involved in the Matewan trial. And this just wasn't a huge win for Sid Hatfield. This was a huge win for the Union and just miners in general. They couldn't beat him in a shootout. They couldn't beat him in the courtroom. Unfortunately, Thomas Phelps was very persistent. Unfortunately, months later, Sid Hatfield was summoned to court again, this time in Welch, West Virginia. And while walking up the courthouse steps, surrounded by Baldwin Felts private detectives, Sid Hatfield was shot and killed in broad daylight. Again, on the courthouse steps. Like, if you want to talk about political corruption, that's about as bad as it gets. With that, living legend and hero to miners everywhere was senselessly cut down for absolutely no reason besides petty revenge by a detective agency. And no one involved in the murder of Sid Hatfield was ever charged. Sid Hatfield's murder and how it was handled, especially by WV Gov, would eventually lead to the largest land battle on American soil since the end of the American Civil War, the Battle of Blair Mountain. And unfortunately, I don't think the 2020s is much different than the 1920s when you look at the lengths that corporations and politicians will go in order to oppress people to defend their bottom lines. Well, I don't trust anyone involved in West Virginia politics as far as I can throw them. And for absolutely no reason, here's a picture of West Virginia's governor. Again, for absolutely no reason. So, I hope you learned something today. If you did, leave a like on this video. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Until next time, don't forget to stay wild, stay wonderful, and I'll talk to you later.